Good day and welcome back to In Conversation with Partners, sponsored by Micro Focus Channel Enablement and BoaTech. This is episode 4, the value of identity-based data access governance. And our usual guest, Boaz, is here, not in his cycling kit, looking lean and mean, ready for the the bikini season. And he's brought a guest today. And we've got Siku Kashane, who is an ethical hacker. What is an ethical hacker, Siku?
Thank you very much for this invitation. I think in terms of ethical hacking, just to break it down in a nutshell, it's more around the technique in terms of bypassing organization security controls to look for flaws. But there are two types of ethical hackers. We've got the white hackers and we've got the black hackers. So my main focus is on the white hat in terms of helping organization in terms of adopting security controls to safeguard their environment.
So your job is to make sure that security is taken seriously and the guys are rolling out what they've said to the board and that there's no chinks in the armor.
Yes, indeed.
You hang out with some interesting people. So Boaz, the boss, how things going?
Thanks, Daniel. Not bad. It's been a roller coaster, interesting change of season the last couple of weeks. But looking forward to the summer, the end of the year. But working hard.
I'm glad. And today's discussion, identity-based access governance, almost speaks for itself as to why it's an important topic. Reducing the risk of a data breach, better governance on unstructured data, streamlining policy and regulatory compliance tasks. This protected view that the organization is looking at, but it's easy to get it wrong. Are you seeing people that are giving it half a go, or do people take identity-based data access governance seriously today?
I think, Daniel, companies and organizations are sort of going half-footed. They're not really taking it serious until they are hacked or they are breached. Because, if you look at the whole standards or the whole issue around identity and access management or access breach is hackers are out there looking for a user or a system or contractor that they can enter the company's data or organizational data through. They're not going to complicate their lives and looking at creating their own access. They just look at the user access, the user who has access into the organizational data, and that access which is authenticated and working properly within the organization's data.
So let's get on the same page. What is the difference between authentication and authorization for access in your mind? It's just so I can understand.
Yeah, authentication is you would have a username and password, and that password and username has to be known within the systems that the organizations use. And authorization is the governance thereof to say, okay, this username and password has been identified, we know it, it works within our system, it's not someone that we don't know, so therefore we can grant this person access. That is authorization.
Okay, brilliant. And when we are talking about authorization, we're also looking at the authentication, authorization, and then list of access points. Hey?
Yes,
is that
indeed.
part of your job as a hacker to check what we said we've given them is what they're allowed to do?
Indeed. Particularly within offensive security and ethical hacking, I think most of the hackers, they actually take advantage of the misconfiguration when it comes to authentication and authorization. So if you have given a user more access, the access that is actually beyond what is required for them to perform their function. So we call it privilege escalation. Privilege escalation is when you have actually granted the user more privilege than what is required. Then that user is being compromised, that an attacker is able to gain access, the same privilege as you have granted the user. So it's very critical to ensure that when we grant the user, especially through the lenses of IAM, because there's also policies that drives IAM in terms of giving them access into the corporate environment as well as the principle of minimality when you deal with access into the environment, so that even if an attacker is able to compromise a user, they do not have even full privileges to perform certain computations within the organization. They only have less privilege, and you also have certain controls as well in terms of, we call it compensating controls.
Yeah.
Those controls is actually to delay an attack, to ensure that even if the user, the attacker can compromise the user, but there are certain controls that will be in place to ensure that we delay this attack and to ensure that we log every event. It's also related to identity and access management, because by mere fact of giving a user an access, it's not enough. You also need to log everything that they are performing within the organization, so that from the security perspective, they build correlations. Those correlations, it gives the security who is in charge for the environment visibility of the environment. So in terms with in relation of identity and access management, and also to reduce the attack surface from the hacking perspective, because the hacker, they rely on any misconfiguration, the configs that are giving user more access or that expose the organizations into these attacks.
Siku, that is awesome. That was a really good idea, overview of what we are dealing with. Is identity management as a system required for all organizations, or is there a threshold that we get to where we've got number of applications? How do you know what the tipping point is in your mind?
In my view, Dan, I think it is required for all organizations, because if you look at the landscape of organizations today, they might take it for granted that they need to have IAM or AIM, as others would know it. But if you look at how organizations are set up, the bigger they grow in terms of numbers, a number of users and systems, the more compromised they become. So if you don't set it up from the onset, the growth that you experience over time might be a risk factor in terms of when you want to implement AIM at a later stage.
So you're growing out of your security.
Absolutely.
So you need to have it baked in from the beginning. So what are some of the features and functions that I'm looking for in a good identity and access management system, an IAM system? Maybe we'll start with you, and then we can get a hacker's perspective, what he doesn't like to come across.
For me, as an organization, you need to define roles. That's the first thing, because when you implement AIM, you first need to know who has what role and what that role entails in terms of their access. So the first thing that you need to define when you're setting up an AIM is to understand the roles and the hierarchy within the organization, so that when Siku, as an ethical hacker, comes in, he needs to know which access do I attack first, or which access do I go for, so that I can have the most critical data that I need. So the most important thing is to define the role and know who has what in which role.
Sure. So if we're looking at an IAM system, we need to be able to define the roles and the hierarchy of the organization. So it's almost like the HR system needs to be replicated on this environment. How important are policies and procedures to support this? How much do policies play a role of driving your setup of your IAM?
Answering this through the lenses of an attacker, I would say generally companies, when they configure IAM, it's actually critical to ensure that from the onset, as they start to configure the IAM as well as the IAM policy, they also adhere to the baseline. They also understand the principle of IAM, because normally they will create a group, and that group has got more privileges. And if you add a user into the very same group that's supposed to be only dedicated only for administrative privileges, when you compromise that user, inherently you assume that role as an administrator. So that's when we start to look at policies. We need to look at policies. We need to look at whitelisting. That also drives the IAM environment, or the architecture, or rather the principle of IAM, to ensure that when we assign this role, we actually looking from the principle of minimality to grant the users the access that they require in order to perform the operations related to their role.
So when we are looking at the setup of this, the policy should be give as little as possible and open as per request.
Yes.
Rather than giving as much as possible and closing down by exception. Okay, I quite like that. That's a nice policy. So now we've set this up for one of your customers. We've got all their applications. We've got IAM set up and everybody's safe. And then somebody goes in and rolls out cloud applications which don't share our single sign-on environment or our IAM because it's coming from somewhere offshore. Does this mean I have to reset everything up? How do you play in a hybrid environment?
So if you look at the two main cloud providers or cloud providers in general, most of them are subscribed to protocol-based connectors that are known as SIM, S-C-I-M. So with that, you can access, if you have a hybrid environment, you can access your cloud-based applications and they're on-prem. So with the SCIM and protocol-based connectors, you can access any application because those cloud providers would have enabled that for users to access that without you resetting and starting from scratch.
Okay, that's excellent. So would the hackers find it a lot easier to break into this hybrid environment, or does the net cover everything in the new technologies that are available?
So in terms of identity access management and also the implementation of a single sign-on, we call it an identity provider, or because the single sign-on, there's multiple implementations when you're talking about a single sign-on. If we are moving and extending our environment into the cloud, so it means we can, from the technical perspective, we can just simply say it's a stretch LAN, or we can just simply say it's a stretch VLAN. So the same controls that we have in place in our on-prem solution, we can also adopt the same security controls that are applicable into cloud. And when you look from single sign-on is not something new. It has been around for many years. We are looking at SAML implementation. We are looking at ADFS implementation. Microsoft also support ADFS. So the integration between cloud and on-prem solution, it's not that complex, but the only challenge is that to understand the capabilities and the offering within the cloud environment. So the challenge comes when those who configure, or rather the engineers that configure this platform, some of them, they might need certain skills or specialties in terms of being able to configure this properly to ensure that we're not exposing any sensitive data into the public network, which is the internet.
Yes.
So the public network that even the attacker, it's easy for them to be able to enumerate the environment. Enumerating the environment, it just simply means to be able to poke around to see if there's any hole, and something that will give them an idea or the knowledge about the environment where they will be able to execute maybe some malicious exploit or rather a payload to gain access into this environment. For an example, let's look at our data store. A simple S3 bucket where normally most of the organization, they store all their sensitive data. It is also driven by IAM policy. So this IAM policy, you can actually define it that expose my data into the public network, but only selected few, they will have access into this. We call it whitelisting. Whitelisting is also important, it's very critical, especially when we configure at the cloud, but the cloud is mainly driven by IAM policy. IAM policy, and there's also another element of accounting of which most AWS, they rely on that in terms of billing. But the IAM is the key, is the critical component when it comes to cloud implementation and also the integration of two environments. Let's say you've got a third party. A third party, you want them to integrate into your environment, to have access into the environment. Now we look at certain functionalities or capabilities within AWS or rather Microsoft and other cloud providers. They do support something that is called API. API, it's not new, it has been there, especially from the development. So we've been adopting this in terms of the integration. So it's very seamless, it's easy to integrate with any third party or any application to exchange data. But there's also a critical component within the API, it's security. And this security is also driven by identity and access management and also the configuration, how you share the data with the third party, that exchange. We are talking about security, we are also talking about IAM implementation. So IAM is key in every environment.
So what Siku's been talking around here makes sense for me over our systems of record and our systems that are in process. Do we need to take care of unstructured data on this? So we're looking at email, video, voice recordings, or is it only for transactional systems? Where does this identity system start and stop in the enterprise in your mind?
If you look at today's changing structures of data, you would agree with me that data growth has been sprawling from the unstructured side compared to the structured side. So if you compare the two, the criticality is leveling, because if you look at a voice recording or video, the kind of recordings that are happening, especially with the lockdowns that we've been in, most of the critical data is being shared across online meetings. And that data, when it gets extracted, it becomes unstructured data. So storing that data where it sits and how you classify it in terms of its importance becomes very critical. So you can't ignore that and just focus on the relational database data that is sitting there, for example, your ERP systems. The data that sits on the unstructured side is equally as important as your data that sits on structured side. So you would want to put roles in place, you would want to have access controlled for that kind of data. So the importance is really growing on there. So I would say have access and identity management on both sides.
Excellent, thank you. So what you're saying is that data is the new gold.
Yes.
We need to protect that data before someone takes it away from us.
Indeed.
If we are maturing as a customer, what are the policies that we need in place in order to get our IAM system rolled out most effectively? What are the 3 pieces of corporate legislature that we need, that you would say?
I think the most important would be knowing where and how your data is managed or where your data sits. So that's the first thing, because you can't protect what you don't know. You can't protect data whereas you don't know where it sits. So you need to really have discover your data.
So we need a policy on data storage and structure.
Absolutely. So
Yes.
in a nutshell, call it data discovery.
Okay.
That's the first thing that you would really want to implement and run within your organization. And after you have done that discovery, classify that data, know what kind of data sits where, and in that way you would know how to use proper hierarchy within your organization to say, okay, this data is critical because it holds this kind of records. So for me, those are the 2 main things that you need to have implemented before you can build your governance around your data access.
Awesome, I like that. So once we've classified our data, is that a static environment or is this revisited periodically? What are you seeing in this, Siku?
I think from data perspective, as we're looking at the classifying data, classification is also key. It's very important. And I think every attacker will love to land into an environment where data has already been classified, because there are techniques today, especially in the country, where we see most companies, they've been compromised, they've been hacked, and the attacker, they land into the environment. Now they start to understand this environment. They want to understand the core of what drives this particular company before they can even execute ransomware. Ransomware is just a technique to encrypt data, and I've got a key. I'm holding your ransom. You've got your entire data. I've got my key here with me. I say, for you to be able to decrypt the data, you need to pay me a ransom, then I will give you a key to decrypt your data back in plain text.
So we stuck outside the gates of our house going, let me in, and they say, pay. I've been through a roadblock or 2 like that where they say, I think it's Coke money that people are asking me. I'm not quite sure. Give me a Coca-Cola. Yeah. Okay, so that's what ransomware does. But you're saying the data classification is actually helping them?
Classification, it actually helps both because of the organization to be able to drive the business. They need to classify this data. And also classification, it also goes hand in hand with data privacy.
Okay.
Because you need to classify it and also have defined privacy of this data, because you understand this type of data. You understand that this is critical data. So I need to ensure that anyone who wants access to this, they get the necessary privileges into this data.
You know, I'm cheating, Chauke, because Poppy is a special area for me. So I am cheating. I did understand there. I was only playing with you. But, you know, you said something earlier, which is this identity protection that we're putting in place.
Yes.
And the fact that the organization is looking at this is almost like when we drive through the middle of town and you leave your bag and your cell phone on the seat. We wouldn't do that as people who live in Johannesburg. Maybe if you live overseas where there is no crime ever, I believe, that's what everybody says, then you can. But we're not that stupid. Hey, we put it in the back of the car where it's
indeed.
covered.
Indeed.
And we're talking about that from a data access governance perspective.
Yes, indeed.
Keeping your important data in the boot that no one can access it unless they've got the key.
Yes.
Is there any sort of ROI on this unless we've had a breach, and we've spoken about ransomware, which makes sense? Is there any ROI for investment in an identity and access management system in your mind?
Absolutely, Dan. Because if you look at how users manage to access the environment, today you have a huge environment with multiple applications that they're running. So each and every user who accesses that environment, and they have access to, for example, an SAP application that runs HR and finance, those users, they would need to store those passwords, and it makes their lives quite difficult to manage that environment, to have access. And then when they forget the password, they need to phone the help desk to reset the password. And that is time and money for the organization, because the employment of keeping that help desk running efficiently and returning calls and resetting password on time, reducing the production time for those guys, gets compromised. So the users would need to shorten their time to access the environment. So with that is an immediate return on investment for organization to have single sign-on, for example.
Okay,
and
that makes total sense.
Reset. Yeah. And not only that, you can also have return on investment for business, easy access to the business environment. You're not taking too much time to spending time, to access the environment. You can just reset the password, and then access to the business applications and operational efficiency is met.
I like that. That's really, really good. All right, if we've decided we're spending money on a good IAM system, we're going to put data access governance in place, identity-based, we're going to roll this out. Where do we start?
I think we've touched on it, but you would have discovered your data, you have classified your data, you have assigned roles to your users.
Okay.
Those are the first areas that you need to look at. Say, okay, I have this data, I know where it sits, and I have this users, thousands of users are sitting in my environment. So first thing is to give them roles, then knowing that, okay, when I implement this system, this user will have access to this environment.
But maybe I'm cheating again. I'm asking this, and let me get it easier. Do I start on my finance system? Do I start on my inventory system? Do I have to do everything all at once? Do I start on my email system? Which application sets do we start at if we run?
I think CQ, as an ethical hacker, would know where to start.
Okay.
I think the starting point would be now, let's look first in terms of how do you gain access into the environment. We've got technologies in place that drives access. Let's start from the on-prem solution. We've got Active Directory. Active Directory, it also drives the authentication. It also, you can actually create groups within Active Directory. And firstly, what you create is a user. And that user must belong to a group. And that group has got privileges into the resources, into the environment. That is purely access. If you want to grant a user an access into an ERP system, they need to belong into a particular group. Okay. That group has got access into the ERP system. But it's not only that. Now we are looking at another layer, authorization. Are you authorized to access this table? Or you are restricted from accessing this table. Now, from the ethical hacking perspective, you try to look at someone who might have privileges to access in terms of authorization. Now you've got access, you've compromised the user's got access into the ERP system. They belong to a group. But now in terms of authorization, they don't have access. What do? There's something we call it privilege escalation. It might be vertically, it might be horizontal. That's where, from ethical hacking space, we try now to grant ourselves access in terms of exploiting certain vulnerabilities or issues within the system that have been configured.
Okay. Excellent. So we actually start the total different way that I thought, and we start by how do we break into the environment. So we start with the walls around the environment, and we move in from there as we gradually layer it more and more and more.
Yes.
Brilliant. That's really nice. Okay. And then what would you say is the low risk areas that people spend too much time on?
I think with today's breaches that are happening everywhere, none is low risk really. I think every area of the business is quite critical because, if you consider one to be low risk, the hackers might use that business to enter into other critical environments because systems within the business are interconnected.
Awesome. That's a good reminder for me as well. Everywhere is connected today in our digital world. When we are integrating third-party systems and our first-party systems, this system-to-system integration, does that also have to go via the IAM?
Yes, I would say yes, indeed. It needs to go through IAM and also define the policies. Even though there is much more in terms of beyond IAM implementation, we're looking at integrating these two systems. Basically, we are building a trust between the two systems. So when there is a trust and a handshake, it's based on IAM. So that implementation of IAM is also required in terms of when we integrate two systems or a third party that integrates with your environment. And we're also looking at its IAM, its encryption, that's cryptography, and you also define the schemes or the parameters in terms of how to communicate there. And you also want to ensure that everything that is passing through there, you also log it as well. That's one of the benefits of IAM. You can also collect the logs and also correlate the logs to ensure that at any given point when there is an issue, maybe it might be a misconfiguration, the attacker is trying to intercept that communication and to gain access into the environment. You also have sight of what is happening. You feed the logs for your security team to be able to build correlations. It's also data. You mentioned also unstructured data. It's also part of the unstructured data, but you want to collect this and build correlations using the data. So it means every data is very important and critical for the organization.
Awesome. You wanted to add anything to that? Are you happy with that answer?
Yeah, he has it.
He's got it. What he said, he's amazing. So this identity-based data access governance, if we accept that everyone in every entity has an identity and we need to know who they are and why they're accessing the network, that's like the mantra. That's not a tattoo you've got on your arm, is it? Right. In summary for our listeners who are somewhat skeptical, in an elevator pitch, what's the main benefits of implementing an IAM system to give you this control?
I think the last time we touched on one critical factor, if I had to put a billboard on N1, if you remember that.
Yeah.
It is, putting IAM, you are also securing by design,
Okay.
So you are putting that in place, and that's one of the critical areas of security because it is an entry point into your organization. Threats, hackers, and everyone else, they will try to enter through your Active Directory, as you mentioned earlier, and then into your environment. So Active Directory will be the first point. That will be you secure by design and throughout your setup in the organization.
That's under the BoaTech coat of arms, is security by design. Don't let it happen by accident. And I think that's a really good segue out of this discussion, which is this doesn't have to happen by accident. You don't have to kick your toe. That's why micro-focused channel partners are out there. That's why BoaTech existence is to put plans in place to allow you to take a predictable, measured step into security and raising your game. Thank you for that. Thanks. It's been a very interesting discussion for me. I have one more question. Siku, when you go and visit your grandmother, do you tell her you're a hacker, and does she know what it means, or how do you describe your job?
Normally, I would say, in order for you to explain what you do, you should be able to simplify it even to the young one to be able to understand that this is what I normally do. And when I go to work, I sit in front of the machine, then this is what is hacking in simple terms. But you are not actually saying because I'm a hacker, because everyone now will start to keep their phones and their wallet closely, thinking that this guy will now want to rob us. Basically, a hacker is, from the white hacker perspective, it's someone who helped the organization to adopt security controls and also to verify and to validate that what they've implemented, it works correctly and no one will have access to the environment or exploit the configuration that has been implemented.
Excellent summary. Thank you, Siku Kachane, for joining us. We look forward to this partnership going from strength to strength. From my side, Daniel Robus, I'd like to say thank you to Micro Focus for sponsoring this In Conversation episode 4, and we look forward to the next ones. From us, signing off.
Yeah. Thank you.